Welcome, everyone, to the Tethys Shipyard. I am Takeshi Yamato, the Yard Master, joining our host, the Housecoat Gamer.
Yo.
Today, we are covering the next stage of the Bird of Prey lineage. Well, the next family in the Bird of Prey lineage. The Burrell family. This one's basically one of the longest running. The book, I, the the Star Trek Adventures Klingon Core rulebook has 4 ships that follow the Bird of Prey, that follow the Burrell design, that are basically variants of the Burrell design. The Burrell class herself, introduced in 2280, the Il Chapar Heavy Explorer, also known as the Bloodhawk, the D-12, and the Cavort. And Ron is and Starfleet Command also gives us a slightly larger variant in the QuD class. So I'm going to start with the basic Burrell, and again we're going to cover I'm going to cover the Burrell and D-12 together because Ron finds how they did this a bit off. So I will do the Burrell, I will do the D-12, then Ron will do combined lore for both, combined proper lore for both, and then we'll move on to the next variant. Okay, so the original Burrell class Bird of Prey entered service in 2280. Overview. Before Katinga, the guy who redesigned the D7 into the Katinga class, discovered the Romulan treachery with trading our empire faulty cloaking devices, the engineers in the KDF began designing a starship capable of using the faulty cloaking device as is. Basically, when they got cloaking devices, they couldn't work with original D7s, so they were designing a new ship, and Katinga figured out a way to use those cloaks with the D7, thus creating the Katinga.
Romulans.
Yep.
People keep saying that you can trust them when every time.
Yeah. Anyway, this vessel would need to have a low internal volume, thin armor plating in order to allow the cloaking field to adequately project around the vessel, and have sufficient power capability to allow the operation of the cloaking field and other vital ship systems. Early on, it was determined that a bird of prey design similar to the Von Tak class would provide the ideal form for the new vessel. The first Burrell launched in 2280 and undertook a harrowing shakedown cruise that had the vessel journey from Kronos to the Federation world of Mars, where it observed the expansion of Utopia Planitia that was ongoing at the time, and then returning to the homeworld, all while undetected and undercloaked. This tremendous success showed the Chancellor and the great houses the potential for this vessel, and by 10 years after its introduction, Burrell-class birds of prey were leaving the Empire's dry docks at the same rate as Katinga-class battlecruisers. The success of Katinga in not only uncovering the Romulan lies, but in redesigning the D7 and building the first Burrell, allowed him to start his own lesser house. The Burrell class would become the inspiration for 2 further birds of prey designed by House Katinga, the D-12 and the Cavort class. Capabilities. Like most large Klingon starships, the Burrell class bird of prey consists of a command pod at the end of a long boom. This boom attaches to the vessel's main engineering and support hull and pitch adjustable wings. The command pod contains the bridge and large captain's quarters that both had its own sanitation facilities and an area dedicated to either a targ pit or a gach breeding tub so the commanding officer may always have fresh food on hand. The majority of the small crew of 12 to 20 officers and enlisted lived and worked in the engineering hull. Directly behind the junction of the boom and engineering hull was the cloaking device. Direct power linkages between the cloaking device ran aft into the vessel's small matter-antimatter reactors, allowing the device to draw directly on warp plasma, rather than putting a heavy demand on the EPS system. After the warp core are two multi-stage fusion reactors that function on a deuterium reaction, but can run on standard hydrogen at a lower efficiency. The power generated from these reactors give the Burrell class an impressive sublight acceleration, and a top warp velocity of warp 9.9 for a very short duration. While the cloak is active, the drain on power is more extreme than later classes, and cruising warp velocities are reduced to warp 5 for the original production runs. Later improved to warp 6.5 depending on how well the warp coils in the vessel's highly adjustable wings could compensate for disturbed spacetime.
Note that is probably on the TNG scale.
Yeah. Next, and before we get to stats or even Ron's lore, we are going to cover the D12. The Generations fans may note this as the vessel the Duras whores used when they attacked the Enterprise D. Entered service date is 2315 according to the book, and it reads as follows. Overview. The routine maintenance and replacement of warp coils had become a concern for the Empire, as our borders were quickly being pushed further anti-spinward, away from the Federation and into regions with few warp-capable civilizations that had infrastructure the KDF could use for repairs and refurbishments. The use of the basic design of the Burrell was an intelligent choice, as the adaptable subspace geometry of the vessel due to the warp coils and its pitch variable wings meant that less strain would be on each individual coil. House Katinga proposed the D12, a larger and more capable version of the Burrell class. As much of the equipment in most systems would be standard across the Burrell and D12, the High Council and the generals of the KDF agreed to the design without passing it through the regular reviews. This act would later result in discommendation of 2 KDF generals and 4 separate claims for the right of vengeance against House Katinga. The first D-12 was launched from the Katinga Orbital Factory in 2315 and was assigned to commanders and crews with experience operating as scouts from older Burrell-class vessels. The majority of the hulls produced went into service with the KDF, though a small amount served in the fleets of House Konja and Martok. In 2339, a D-12 serving House Konja, IKS Konja's Mekhleth, suffered a plasma coil failure while cloaked during a mission inside the Gorn hegemony. According to the emergency transmission, the vessel's cloak failed catastrophically, causing damage to the impulse engines. As the vessel was following a Gorn Varanus-class battleship, it was spotted and quickly destroyed with the loss of all warriors on board. The second disaster followed with a KDF D-12 having to eject its warp core, after a plasma coil failure overloaded the entire EPS system. House Katinga almost fell due to these faulty plasma coils staining its honor. While fighting against rites of vengeance from the relatives of the dead warriors of Konja's Mekhleth, the engineers of that house determined that the plasma coils used for warp and impulse propulsion in the design were at fault, and were integral to the class. Rather than attempt to recall and refit each D-12 in service, House Katinga recommended that the D-12 be taken out of active service and be replaced with a ground-up redesign of the bird of prey, the QuD-Class. All KDF D-12s were retired by 2353, but lesser, more desperate houses continue to use them in their fleets to this day. Capabilities. While the failure of the D-12 and its removal from service is the reason many in the KDF remember this class, this bird of prey did have many impressive features. The D-12 had a crew complement of between 80 and 130, depending on the assignment, and due to this larger crew complement, the vessel came with a sizable Targ breeding pit and Gach farm. The Gach farm is actually a part of the waste recycling systems on board, and took strain off the mechanical and chemical parts of that system. A full crew could go for years without having to return to a Klingon colony world to restock on Gach. Like the Burrell class, the D-12 had forward and aft mounted photon torpedo launchers and swivel mounted disruptor cannons at the end of each wing. In addition, there were 2 disruptor banks over the aft impulse manifold that gave the D-12 a greater range of firing patterns than the Burrell class. Armor, internal bulkheads, and structural integrity fields were strengthened to deal with the greater mass of the D-12, giving it better maneuverability and acceleration compared to vessels of similar mass, but also making the systems deep inside its engineering hull difficult to damage. By 2369, engineers of House de Gore had developed a new plasma coil to replace the faulty equipment, but it only mattered to them as they were the last house to continue to use them instead of the newer QuD-class birds of prey. Even then, their reputation makes many warriors feel to serve on them is to be dishonored. Alright, Ron, your go for the Burrell and the D-12. First up, your notes. First up, your opinions on the lore as stated.
Well, for one, the Burrell entered service a hell of a lot sooner than 2280. The ship's actually been around for almost 90 years as of TNG.
Right, so probably 2270s then.
Yep. Also, the designation. The D-12 and the D-12 as seen in Generations was just a bog standard Burrell. In fact, it used the same bloody model as the one that had been introduced in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, which introduced a number of notable vessels such as the Oberth and Excelsior classes.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Klingon vessels typically have a different designation system.
Yeah.
Frigate-class vessels, such as the Burrell, actually go by the E designation.
Right.
As seen here with the E-12 Burrell. And since E and D sound somewhat alike, it's very easy to make the mistake.
Yep. So,
ergo, the vessels seen in Generations and, well, Movie 3 are the same class, the E-12.
Yep. So, let's go for the more canon-accurate lore. You're up.
With Birds of Prey becoming out of date, thanks to stolen Federation technology quickly proving too difficult to retrofit onto older vessels, though the much larger D7 class, which would later be refitted into the D7C, the older Birds of Prey had to be scrapped. However, the design of the older Machala class, as seen in the last vid, were just too valuable to get rid of. Fortunately, the variable geometry warp wing design had some more time to adapt to circumstances. 20 years more time, in fact, thanks to the Organians.
Yes, and not to mention, during the brief Romulan-Klingon alliance, not only did they get cloaking devices, they also got a few Romulan ships, including their own take on the warp wing technology, the Kite class. I think.
Hang on a moment. Ta-da! Looks very similar, don't it?
Yeah.
Now, while it doesn't have the same variable wings as the Burrell, and only has a single torpedo launcher, well, the Kite is fusion-powered rather than antimatter powered.
Yeah.
There was an incident on a moon that, forced the Praetor to ban matter-antimatter experiments.
Yeah. So, yeah. I do like I do like some of the lore about the D7, about the Klingon Romulans providing faulty cloaking devices that wouldn't work with the D7 as stated. But I the kites are definitely an interesting thing to have sent over as well, as in here's something that does work with these cloaking devices. And the Klingons go, "Oh jeez, this is basically our stuff."
But made to be more efficient.
Yeah.
Because the Romulans were working with fusion power instead of a matter-antimatter reaction chamber.
Yeah.
Regardless, the two designs were hybridized into the Burrell. Ironically enough, we have seen the prototype of this vessel. Kirk managed to steal it after blowing up the Enterprise, which I do not like mentioning.
Yeah.
Krug's vessel was the prototype of the class, and has since been renamed HMS Bounty, and is now serving quite happily as an exhibit at the Fleet Museum, though her cloaking device would be stolen by Jack Crusher and Sidney LaForge for use on the USS Titan A, later Enterprise G.
Yes.
120 years later, and Kirk is still saving everyone's asses.
Yep. Anyway.
There would be a modified version of the Burrell class, known as the E-12X. We all know this one. It's the one Chang used to try and destroy the Enterprise A, and, well...
Yeah.
The E-12, of course, had a problem. The plasma coils and its cloaking device were exceptionally flawed, and when subjected to an ionized pulse, would force the cloak to engage or disengage, as was used when the Duras Whores attacked the Enterprise D. Because they had transferred all their power to shields, and they had seen some upgrades, to at least survive a running skirmish with a Galaxy-class starship. While the Duras Whores would have the last laugh, they did force the warp core on the D to go to breach.
Yeah.
When the cloak activated, the shields dropped, and, well, a photon torpedo from the 2370s is gonna hurt a lot more than one from 100 years before.
Oh, yeah. And so...
Before we move on to the next model of the Burrell, the E-15, we have to deal with this.
The QuD.
QuD. In Klingon, this word means insurrection, which is rather fitting when a general of the KDF decided to challenge the High Council's final decision on the production of a starship of this class. And the story is actually rather interesting. In war simulations, it became a game of light cruiser attrition with the Federation. And because Miranda-class starships are essentially just Connies with smaller skin, without a secondary hull, it became a game of how long can it take us to outproduce them, and the Klingons were losing the war. So, this KDF general decided, hey, we need a destroyer-class vessel, something awesome to complement our D5s. Of course, the High Council kept going, screw you, we don't need them, the light cruiser does well. Then he programmed a simulation with a slightly upscaled model of Bird of Prey, up by, I'm gonna say 25%. And, well, it started going really well for the KDF after that. In honor of his accomplishments, and his,
going against orders,
they named the vessel Insurrection Class. and the ship actually served rather well, serving as a massive counterpart to ships like the Aquila-class, especially with its secondary weapon, the frequency-modulated particle accelerator cannon, otherwise known as the Meson gun, an anti-shield buster. While not as powerful, and it could do anything to hulls, well, it allowed the ship to punch well above its weight.
Yep.
In order to lead destroyer squadrons composed mostly of Barrels with a couple of QuDs, a new variant was created as a command vessel, the Vlod, or Captain class. This removed the Meson gun due to the increase in capabilities for its command and control systems. While by no means a true flagship, she was a squadron leader, with capable ECM and ECCM capabilities. Of course, these ships would not survive the Khitomer Accords unscathed, and eventually technology just made them obsolete, in favor of a far simpler and easier to design subtype. Ironically enough, the Cavort.
Yeah. So, but before we get to the Cavort, both book and our version, we must cover the E-15. And also, the Chapar Heavy Explorer. I'm not going to read the full thing for overview and capabilities. I'm just mainly going to summarize it. The Tuyuk, for the Chapar, entered service date is 2295, and the Tuyuk was over a century old, and Chancellor Azit Burr tasked the KDF to design a new vessel capable of replacing the Blood Moths. And two separate tribble infestations breaking out caused the need for these vessels to become more urgent.
The Great Tribble Hunt.
Yes. Using the Burrell class as a baseline, just as the Tuyuk used the Von Tok as a baseline, the new ships were called the Chapar class, or Bloodhawk, named in honor of the Tuyuk's nickname of Blood Moth. They were basically outwardly similar, but an additional deck was added to the command pod and boom. 3 decks were added to the engineering hull to contain to house more sensor suites and probe launchers. And the first 4 vessels launched were assigned to search for the source of the Tribble plague. And assistance of previous investigations, the second ship of the class, the IKS Bottas Etlich, ETLH in English lettering, backtracked the Bottas Eth. They backtracked the travels of these merchants and discovered the Tribble homeworld as the 4th world of the Iota Geminorum system. And after the Armada formed to annihilate it, the honor of striking the first blow fell to the IKS Bortas Eth, with its multiple probe launchers armed with photon torpedoes. Even 70 years later, over 70 years later, molten surface of that world still warms the hearts of warriors passing through the system. And songs are sung in the great halls in memory of that crew. Afterward, after the extermination of the Tribbles, the Chapar continues to serve in the KDF as a primary long-duration exploratory craft.
And I'm pretty sure I know why.
Yeah. Even with larger vessels being constructed, the Uchippar class has continued to serve well in its mission profile through routine refits to its computer systems, sensor palettes, and subspace communication links to its onboard probe systems. That was direct from the book, and the capabilities are also going to be from the book. Outwardly, the Uchippar class closely resembles the Burrell bird of prey, but has extra decks to house specialized sensors, exploratory equipment, and crew. Near the junction of the lowest deck of the boom to the engineering hall, there are two semi-recessed docking points for small shuttles that allow the movement of personnel in situations where transporters are unavailable or the landing of the vessel is not feasible. The additional deck on the command pod contains the primary planetary sensor array and additional targeting sensors for the vessel's probe launchers. Along the ventral side of the secondary hull are an additional 4 probe launchers that can also be loaded automatically with photon torpedoes from a shared magazine that runs down the center line of the starship. As each of these launchers is designed to receive and analyze incoming probe telemetry, when used as torpedo launchers, the torpedoes can continually receive updated sensor data from the vessel's main array, adjusting trajectory much more quickly than similar systems on battle cruisers. Like the Blood Moth before it, the Blood Hawk has large sensor domes on the ventral and dorsal sections of its wings. These domes allow for multispectral scanning to occur from multiple sources, building a detailed picture of any target through interferometric techniques. These domes would become smaller with the introduction of isolinear computing in the 24th century, but also allowed for even higher resolution scans at longer distances. During ground assaults in the Dominion War, the Uchippar class was prized in fleets for its ability to provide a continuous stream of torpedoes against Breen and Jem'Hadar starships, but also for providing intense suppression fire from orbit during planetary assaults. First used to destroy a hated plague, these vessels have continued to serve honorably against other enemies of the Empire.
And that brings us to the modern Burrell. Though I must add something about the Uchippar class. The original variants are probably composed of E-12s that have been given some retrofits, while modern versions are built from the very similar but very different E-15, otherwise known as the modern Burrell. After all, if the hulls are more or less the same, why change the class designation? I mean, that's what they did with the modern Katinga class.
Yeah.
Regardless, here we go. The cloaking device of the E-12 proved to be something of a flaw. With how many times an ionized pulse accidentally deactivated the damn thing. And the fact that the original E-12 couldn't exactly operate without it, Housecoat had to redesign the ship with new cloaking technology that didn't suffer that fatal flaw the Romulans had introduced. Enter the E-15 class, which used a new cloaking device using far more, shall we say, robust plasma coils. Of course, the upgrades didn't just end with that. Minor upgrades to the disruptor cannons, including additional cannon pods for lighter disruptors on the wingtips. The same gun pods, I might add, we see on other Burrells, most notably in STO.
Yeah.
And a improved loading mechanism for the photon torpedo launchers. That said, there isn't much to say about the external appearance. It's very difficult, at a glance, to tell which Burrell is which one is the E-15, and which one isn't. numerous examples of the E-15 in service, the most famous of which, of course, is the IKS Rotaren, flagship of General Martok, son of Urthog. Of course, we already know the history of that glorious one-eyed giant.
Yeah.
The E-15 continues in service with the KDF, despite being supplanted by the new E-18 Core class, which is in effect an E-15 with some extra features, including a ridiculous sensor array that looks like a pair of bayonets mounted on the command pod. But that is a ship for another time.
Yeah.
I don't suppose we need to stat these things.
Yeah, we've already done that, and if you want to find stats for the D12 for the basic Burrell, the D12 as in the book, and the Chapar, they are in the Klingon Core rulebook. We will cover one more variant, the QuD-Class. It basically uses the Burrell model, but it is much larger.
Significantly so.
Yeah. To the point that it's scale 5 as opposed to the Burrell's scale 3. And I will read the book story, which follows the D12 story as read in the book. Then Ron can do our version.
Which makes more sense.
Yeah. So, overview. The QuD is 2349. It entered service. After the incidents with the D12, the starship designers of House Katinga decided to attempt to regain their honor and clear the reputation of their bird of prey design by scaling the vessel upwards in size and capability to produce the largest and most powerful warship in the Empire, the QuD-Class. Production of the space frame suffered setbacks as larger and more complex dry docks were required to be built to support construction. The first of these dry docks was finished in high polar orbit over Kronos, followed soon after by an asteroid-based facility in the Katinga system and a similar facility built inside a sizable chunk of the remains of Praxis. The first of the new QuD-Class vessels launched in 2349 and immediately had a trial by fire in a border conflict with the Gorn hegemony that had begun the year previously. Any doubts to the quality of the systems installed proved to be unfounded, as IKS QuD itself spent 2 years on constant patrol between Torna 4 and Cestus 3, achieving 3 confirmed Gorn cruiser and 2 frigate kills during that time. After the border conflict ceased with this hegemony, ceding 6 uninhabited but strategically important star systems to the Empire, conversion of smaller docks to be able to handle the construction of the QuD-Class began in all of the great houses. In just 10 standard years, the new birds of prey became more numerous than the Katinga in the KDF. Production of this space frame is only slowed with the development of the Vorcha-class battlecruiser and Egvar-class battleship, but this now iconic design will surely have a place in the fleet for many decades to come. Capabilities. A much larger design than the D-12 or Burrell-class birds of prey, the QuD requires a crew of 200 for assignments where combat is not expected, such as patrolling the Federation border or assisting in exploration of the anti-Spidward reaches of the Empire. A crew of 500 plus 100 specially trained warriors used to board enemy vessels is more typical during combat operations where casualties would normally reduce a smaller crew's effectiveness. One of the most significant system changes from smaller models is the vessel's Bussard ram scoop and reaction control system. The leading edge of each wing contains 4 separate magnetic and subspace field generators that pull in all atomic and low-mass molecular material, diverting the deuterium to the fusion reactors and the warp core storage tanks for later use. All other material is processed into the replicator system, or if it is compressible, such as helium, it is shunted to RCS tanks spread out across the wing. The extra input is needed, as the Cavort class has nearly double the amount of thrusters as more recent designs of similar mass, such as the Vorcha class. During combat maneuvers, the vessel's impressive impulse drive and the RCS fine-tunes the vessel's angle of attack and can even allow the vessel to swing end over end in less than 2 seconds. Additionally, the wings can independently pitch, yaw, and roll to compensate for the loss of thrusters from combat damage and more easily bring the vessel around onto a course the helmsman requires. Like other Housecoat birds of prey, the Cavort class has wing-mounted disruptor cannons that independently swivel and target hostile starships. These vessels also have a disruptor array wrapped around the command pod, a disruptor array around the trailing edge of each wing, and 2 small arrays protecting the vessel's belly shuttle bay. While these vessels have a forward and aft mounted torpedo launch system, designers also include 2 hardpoint mounts near the wingtips for rapid fire torpedo launch systems or for probe command and control systems, depending on the needs of the KDF. Alright, Ron, your go for our.
With the Khitomer Accords and the increasing obsolescence of the QuD and VOD classes, but the continued love for these particular designs, the KDF and Housecoat in particular decided to upscale the design. After all, if it works on smaller scale, it's sure gonna work. It must work on a larger one, right? I really don't have to point out the flaws in that thinking, don't I?
Yeah.
Regardless, the Cavort class was introduced into service far sooner than the lore, as the VOD left service in the 2320s, and was immediately replaced by the Cavort, though the general lore for what happened is much the same. That said, the ship was primarily designed to emulate, to a point, certain Federation tactics. Particularly, the introduction of the Steamrunner class changed Cavort doctrine significantly. As during the Cardassian Federation border wars, Steamrunner class vessels were commonly equipped with long-range photon torpedoes to serve as artillery ships, much to the consternation of Cardassian personnel. And Klingons, being Klingons, thought this was a good idea. It was. But they didn't have the appropriate design for that. Mostly because the Steamrunner has more torpedo tubes than any Klingon ship ever could. That said, the Cavort class would have a rapid-fire torpedo launcher installed in its nose, capable of firing 3 torpedoes every minute, serving as an effective, if makeshift, artillery platform. Of course, its primary role was to replace the QuD class, and to a point, replace the now increasingly obsolescent, but not quite obsolete, Katinga class. Its general roles, of course, are much the same as the ones Take explained as. That said, the ship is increasingly becoming obsolete. The design, while upscaled, is basically 90 years old at the point of its introduction. And while the Dominion War certainly kept it alive for a little bit longer, let's be honest, it's not going to last much longer. With the introduction of reintroduction of the Raptor class, and the continued production of Vorcha-derived designs, it's becoming increasingly difficult to justify the continued production of the Cavort class. In fact, there has already been talks among the High Council of ending production of this venerable vessel. But it will continue in production so long as she can perform a role.
Yes, and even if the KDF itself doesn't use it, it is more than likely that great houses will still use this venerable design.
After all,
Now,
there is no dishonor in using this ship. Just as there is technically no dishonor in continuing to use the D-12. You just have to deal with its quirks.
yeah. And so, and stat-wise, I've shifted the Cavort's entered service date from 2349 to 2331 based on what Ron has stated. The systems values for the Cavort in the book are comms 9, computers 8, engines 10, sensors 8, structure 9, weapons 11. I've basically scale 5 starship in 2331 would have 54 points to work with. So to get that to fit, I removed 1 point each from engines and weapons.
Wouldn't be
So
difficult to put them back in.
yeah, just as refits as the time passes by. So if you're doing a ship, so basically if you're doing a Klingon ship in the 2370s, which is one of the default time, like the default time for a game for a Star Trek Adventures game in the TNG era is 2371. Just add those points back in before adding more refits. It also has 1 point each command and 1 point in security, 2 points in con, disruptor cannons, disruptor array, photon torpedoes, strength 4 tractor beam, cloaking device, improved impulse drive, and improved reaction control system. So, yeah, that is the Cavort class, and that is the entire Burrell family of Klingon birds of prey.
We'll be moving on to the STO era soon.
Yeah,
But but that's not going to be today.
right.
Bye bye.